The real reason the U.S. wants Canada. The coming water war on March 14, 2028. A conference room in Washington goes dark for a second, then lights up again. A map appears on the wall. Blue lines, red warning zones, and one thin border that suddenly looks like a bad joke. We think nations fight over flags, ideology, or pride. That's the bedtime story. The real story lives in the ledger, where water is a line item. When the balance sheet turns red, morality disappears. This isn't about diplomacy. It's about bankruptcy and insolvency wearing suits. Because a country can survive bad headlines, it cannot survive a negative water balance. The modern American West was built like a casino. Bright lights, free drinks, unlimited promises. It borrowed against a future it didn't control. And now the bill is due. Look at those glowing desert cities at night. They shine like jewels in a black ocean of sand. They shouldn't exist at this scale, and everyone in power knows it. They are miracles built on credit. Not financial credit, but hydrological credit. Water pulled forward from tomorrow to keep today alive. The kind of borrowing that always ends the same way. At its peak, the system looked invincible. Big dams, endless lawns, fruit in winter. A civilization that made the desert pretend. It was majesty, American style. There were parades of prosperity without uniforms, suburbs expanding like a tide, golf courses like green signatures on brown land, and the quiet confidence that infrastructure equals immortality. The West sold a vision of control. Concrete, steel, and channels carved into the earth like commandments. The public saw engineering. The ledger saw debt. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Not with scandal, not with politics. With math, the kind of math that doesn't negotiate. Every system has a hidden addiction. In the Southwest, it was the addiction to imported water, a dependency so normalized it stopped sounding like a risk. Water became the silent currency, the invisible paycheck, the true subsidy behind every cheap tomato and every new housing tract. An addiction always grows, even when the supply doesn't. Then the monster shows up, not a general, not a foreign leader, a market force with no face. The water index, the bondholders of infrastructure, the investors hunting stability. They don't need to hate you. They only need you to miss payments. And a missed payment in the West looks like an empty reservoir. In this story, the antagonist is a spreadsheet. It speaks in ratios and forecasts. It whispers one sentence into every politician's ear. Find new supply. Because once scarcity enters the balance sheet, the numbers start dictating policy. Not votes, not speeches, numbers. The trap was set decades earlier. The Colorado River was allocated like a drunken inheritance. Too many heirs, too much confidence. Not enough water. They divided it as if the river were a fixed salary. But rivers aren't salaries, they're moods. They rise, they fall, they disappear. The ledger never forgives wishful accounting. By the early 2000s, the math got uglier. Reservoir levels fell. Emergency rules became permanent. And still the cities grew, as if growth itself were a law. Think about that. A civilization expanding its liabilities while its core asset shrinks. That's not development. That's insolvency with landscaping. By 2011, drought wasn't news anymore. It was background noise. Like a dripping faucet you stop hearing until the house floods. Except here, the flood is reversed. The first tragedy was physical. Less snowpack, earlier melts. Hotter air drinking the moisture before it reaches the ground. The sky became a creditor collecting interest. The second tragedy was political. No leader wants to say stop. Stop building. Stop farming like this. Stop pretending. Those words end careers. So the system did what debtors always do. It refinanced. It delayed. It created new financial products, new promises, new pipelines of hope. And then came the third tragedy, the commodification. When water becomes tradable, it stops being sacred. It becomes extractable. By December 2020, the world's financial machinery found a way to price thirst. Once something is priced, it can be leveraged. Once it can be leveraged, it can be taken. That's the pivot. The moment water stops being a public trust and becomes a speculative asset. Let that number sink in. A resource becomes a ticker. The West didn't just face drought. It faced a margin call, because the region's lifestyle was built on the assumption of cheap, abundant flow. When flow drops, costs rise. Emergency infrastructure costs real cash. Desalination costs more cash. Pumping costs more cash. And cash bleeds fast. Municipal budgets start to look like trauma patients. Cities raise rates. Farmers drill deeper. Politicians promise miracles. Nobody admits the underlying truth. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The allies had turned away. That's the rule of three, and it's how empires fall without a single shot. Farmers were the first to feel the blade. Water cuts don't hit condos first. They hit fields. Food is always collateral. Fields get abandoned like foreclosed homes. You can almost hear the soil crack. And when agriculture collapses, the ledger doesn't just lose revenue. It loses stability. Because food is currency too. Bread is political oxygen. When bread prices rise, everything starts to shake. Every protest, every riot, every election. So the question becomes simple. Where do you find new water that doesn't exist? You look north. You look for surplus. You look for a neighbor with a blue balance sheet. Canada sits there like a vault, lakes like scattered coins, rivers like conveyor belts of fresh flow heading into the Arctic, indifferent to human need. To Canadians, that flow is nature. To a desperate American ledger, it's inefficiency. And inefficiency is what accountants are trained to eliminate. This is where the story changes tone. It becomes noir. Because the theft doesn't start with tanks. It starts with memos. A policy paper lands on a desk. It uses soft words. Continental resilience. Shared resource security. Mutual adaptation. But the meaning is hard. The meaning is extraction. The meaning is pipeline. The meaning is control. The oldest trick in finance is to rename the seizure. You don't call it a raid. You call it restructuring. You don't call it theft. You call it liquidity support. And once the language changes, the public follows. People accept what they can pronounce. They fear what sounds violent. So the violence gets dressed up. In this story, the first pipeline is never sold as conquest. It's sold as charity, an emergency measure, a temporary favor, a humanitarian act. Picture the phone call. The president speaks slowly, like a man asking for a loan. The prime minister listens like a banker reading risk. Just a small diversion, the voice says. Just for one season. And the ledger scribbles the real translation. Open the tap. Canada's export economy becomes the lever. Trade, tariffs, border friction, regulatory pain. Pressure doesn't need soldiers when it has contracts, because contracts have chains you sign yourself. Once you build the pipe, your sovereignty becomes a service agreement. That's the danger. Infrastructure changes reality. It creates dependency, and dependency is the oldest weapon on Earth. Now imagine the quiet meetings, not on camera, not in Parliament, in boardrooms with coffee and whiteboards, where water is a number per gallon. Investment funds love stable returns. Water looks stable when you ignore the climate. Pension funds love predictable cash flow. Water sales look predictable on paper. So capital begins to circle, not like a shark in open water, like a lawyer in a hallway, silent, patient, smiling. The project gets split into pieces. That's how mega theft becomes politically digestible. One pumping station, one canal upgrade, one pilot transfer, piece by piece, pipe by pipe. No single step looks like invasion, but the sum becomes irreversible. Here's the ledger logic. If you spend $20 billion building transfer infrastructure, you need decades of guaranteed flow to justify it. That guarantee becomes policy. Then policy becomes treaty language. Treaty language becomes expectation, and expectation becomes entitlement. At some point, the relationship flips. The buyer becomes the owner. Not legally, maybe, but functionally, because the buyer's survival now depends on that flow. And when survival is on the table, ethics becomes decoration, borders become suggestions, paper becomes fragile. There's another twist: biological risk. Different waters carry different organisms. Microscopic hitchhikers that don't need passports. Move northern water south, and you move northern biology south. Parasites, algae, viruses, invasive chaos in a continental bloodstream. Systems collapse quietly at first. A fishery fails. A treatment plant struggles. A new toxin blooms. Then the costs rise again. More cash, more debt. This is how a water fix becomes a long-term liability. The kind of liability that demands more control, not less. And then there is the classic poison of mega projects: contamination from flooded landscapes, mercury stories, toxic legacies, the kind that never shows up in the glossy brochure. So the moral pitch always comes first. We must share. It's only fair. Water is a human right. It sounds noble until you see the invoice. Because in finance, rights and realities are separate columns. A human right can still be collateral when the creditor is thirsty. This is where the smoking gun appears. Not a gun, really. A document, a clause, a legal carve-out written in polite language, a compact, an exemption, a precedent that proves the line can move. Once the line moves once, it can move again. The negotiation reads like a foreclosure. The debtor pleads, the creditor nods. The terms are set, and everyone pretends it's voluntary. Return flow, the document says. Environmental safeguards, it promises. Temporary, it insists. But the ledger knows temporary is a myth. Temporary infrastructure doesn't exist. Once built, it must be fed. Once fed, it must grow. Like any addiction, now we reach the climax, the default. The moment the money and the water run out at the same time. The city announces rationing, then stricter rationing, then emergency deliveries, then relocations. People panic not because they're dramatic, but because they're biological. Hunger arrives in strange forms, not always empty shelves. Sometimes it's $9 lettuce, sometimes it's farms shutting down, sometimes it's migrants inside the same country, and humiliation follows. A place that sold itself as limitless now asks permission to survive. You can feel the dignity evaporate. Sovereignty is solvency. That's the phrase no one wants to say out loud. Because solvency means you can say no. When you can't pay your water bills, you can't say no. When your crops fail, you can't say no. When your cities are burning, you can't say no. So the request to Canada stops being a request. It becomes a schedule, a delivery timetable, a contract drafted under pressure, and Canada faces its own default. Not a financial default, but a sovereignty default. A slow liquidation of control sold as cooperation. The pipes hum, the pumps run, the flow begins. And suddenly, a nation's fresh water becomes part of someone else's operating budget. The public debates morality. The ledger counts revenue. The ecosystem absorbs the bruises. And the future gets mortgaged again. The aftermath lasts longer than the headlines. These deals never end when the drought ends, because the pipe doesn't care about rainfall. Once an export market exists, investors demand stability. They sue for disruptions. They lobby for guarantees. They demand certainty, the cruelest word in nature. Generations grow up assuming the arrangement is normal. Children are born into a continent where water moves like oil, and sovereignty is a negotiable fee. The final check is always written decades later, if it's written at all. It might be a buyout, a nationalization, a treaty renegotiation, a settlement, and the scar remains, like a white ring on a reservoir wall, proof of what was there and what was taken. This is how empires shift without marching armies, not with conquest, but with contracts, not with flags, but with invoices. History isn't decided by speeches. It's decided by accountants, debt, and resources. It's decided by who controls the faucet and who can afford to keep it closed. So when you hear the phrase water sharing, listen for the ledger behind it. Ask who pays. Ask who profits. Ask who loses the right to turn it off. Because the coming water war won't look like a war movie. It will look like infrastructure. It will look like partnership. It will look like paperwork. And by the time the public notices, the pipes will already be in the ground. If you want to stay ahead of the next story like this, subscribe to the channel, because the people who understand the ledger first survive first